They spoke at 3:17 in the morning, not through radio static or a broadcast, but through a stillness that folded the world inward and left a single thought in the air, clear, precise, and strangely kind. They did not deliver doom, they offered a diagnosis. Richard Coleman had spent his life listening to the afterlife of civilizations. As a professor of ancient history, he had traced the ragged end of empires like a cartographer follows a coastline, careful, patient, attentive to where the ground gave way. He had taught students to read ruins not as trophies of failure, but as testimonies, every broken column, every abandoned road, a sentence in an explanation. After retirement, he kept his maps close, the margins of his books crowded with notes, causes, coincidences, telling absences. Insomnia became his companion. It arrived without fanfare, first as a night here, then an accumulation of nights. The quiet turned from a relief into something that asked questions. Richard's mind, trained to assemble fragments into pattern, could not resist. He would sit by the sink in his small kitchen at odd hours, a cup of tea gone cold, a stack of journals on the table, and he would trace the same loop. Why did Rome hollow from within? Why did the Maya leave what they had built? How long before a culture recognizes its own unraveling? One night the loop broke into a different shape. The crickets stopped. It is a small thing to notice, the moment when background life withdraws. Yet in that withdrawal, all ordinary certainties become visible. Sound is a frame. When it vanishes, the frame shows the painting beneath. Richard thought briefly of how many nights had passed like that, empty, thinking a little more than living, and then he heard the idea, as if a thin thread of silk had been pulled taut across the room. We are watching you. The presence was not visible at first. It was a perception that stepped into place like a new color in a familiar painting. The kitchen light threw up a single rectangle on the linoleum floor. The curtains were still. Whatever had entered the room made no shadow, yet the physics of the place shifted. Air lost the habitual drag of sleep. Time focused into small beads. Where there had been only the domestic light and the hum of a refrigerator, there now sat an attention so intense that Richard felt himself shrink to match it. "Do not fear," said the voice. It was not spoken aloud. It came into him as a sentence transmitted directly to the part of the mind that catalogues meaning. The voice was not human in tone. It had the flat, unadorned clarity of a scientific report and the patience of someone who has watched many apprentices stumble through the same mistakes. The feeling was of another being, an observer, rifling through his thought archive, more diagnostic than triumphant. They called themselves the observer in his mind. They said they had been watching civilizations the way a geologist watches strata, looking for layers of cause and effect, for the dry lines that precede collapse. They had names for what they studied, Cathera, Tarvesh, and they had numbers transmitted with the casual authority of an index. 47 observations, 17 reorientations, and a consistent pattern running through many different soil and climate and myth. When the mind translates alien modes into human narrative, numbers travel well. Numbers make strangers comprehensible. The observer did not speak in long proclamations. It rendered things as if handing over a diagnostic manual. There were 3 signs, it said, simple, internal, sequential. The alien's phrasing landed like a set of labels on a table in front of him. Sign 1, internal disconnection. Sign 2, normalization of chaos. Sign 3, loss of collective purpose. They spoke the names almost as if they were breathing, They said as an aside that Richard felt more than heard. These are not predictions so much as observations. Civilizations die quietly long before ruins appear. Collapse is a process, an attrition of capacities. They offered the words without moral condemnation, more like a clinician noting symptoms, and then, with the same neutrality, sketching possible interventions. Richard sat in his chair and let the names arrange themselves in memory. Internal disconnection. He could feel what it named instantly, the small absences in ordinary days, the parts of life that had been outsourced to screens and schedules and contracts. He pictured a living room where two people sat with a shared silence, each scrolling through their own private corridors of images, the house layered with the soft glow of devices. The image was mundane, and therefore somehow worse than melodrama. You have seen this, the voice suggested. You have watched it in the margins of ancient texts, citizens who no longer attended the forums, neighbors who no longer knew each other's names. The observer's thought line suddenly sketched a parallel. Rome, not in a single night of sacking, but in the slow decline of civic muscle. The veteran who once argued in the piazza now keeps to his courtyard. The public rituals that once stitched society together grow threadbare. The voice's exactness mattered more than its origin. It offered cases, cathera, a world that solved for material scarcity and bodily health, but failed to cultivate the interior. On Cathera, individuals achieved comfort and safety, yet an incapacity to be present hollowed their institutions. Citizens became excellent consumers and poor neighbors. Tarvesh, another study, had prospered technologically while its towns became collections of beautifully preserved infrastructure, roads, domes, libraries, without the people who would have given them purpose. Nations, in both cases, did not explode, they ossified.
Richard thought of the mornings he had watched students arrive late for seminars, eyes still fogged by the blue light of a screen. He thought of the way young parents sometimes checked their phones with one hand while holding a child with the other, as if attention could be shared by two channels and still be whole. The diagnosis hit like a cold draft. Internal capacities atrophy when not exercised. Civic life is muscle. Like a body that grows feeble without movement, a society grows weak where attention is denied. This is sign one, Richard heard, clear and clinical. Internal disconnection, the erosion of presence and the weakening of capacities for sustained attention, for conversation without performance, for relationship that is not transactional. The consequence, the observer appended, is not sudden catastrophe, but slow leakage. Institutions lose the fuel of loyalty. Infrastructures rust while people's imaginations are occupied elsewhere. Private affluence, unmarred by shared intent, becomes its own kind of abandonment. Richard could not help himself. He translated diagnosis into practice. In his notebooks, cramped handwriting folded the margins, he wrote presence, capacity, exercise. The observer's tone softened as it conveyed what had worked. In its observations and in the comparative cases it had gathered, the practice of sitting, plain, unadorned presence, had appeared again and again as a lever. Not magic, it said, repetitive, mundane discipline that retrains attention. Someone who can be present can also be reliable. Someone who can be reliably present is more likely to keep commitments, to show up to the shared tasks that constitute a common life. The suggestion felt oddly intimate. 20 minutes a day, sit in silence, no device, no agenda. When you do this repeatedly, you will notice the small fissures in your mind, the reflex to check, the anxiety when nothing happens, and you will watch them shrink. The observer was not prescribing this as a cure, only as a technique, an exercise to rebuild a neglected muscle. Richard tested the idea the next evening, at first as a skeptical scientist might test a method, with a stopwatch and a ledger. 20 minutes is a short contract with time. He sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, the old teapot on the counter like a marker of habit. The first minutes crawled, his mind pinged like a poorly tuned radio. He thought of his students, his wife when they were younger, the persistent hush of his house. He noticed the reflexes, an itch to reach, a memory that wanted to be played. He watched them pass without taking the bait. After 3 days, the house felt slightly different. A neighbor stopped by on her way home and said, with that casual astonishment of someone seeing a human being in the flesh rather than a waveform, "You look settled." The compliment was small, but it registered as evidence. People noticed the quality of presence as if it were an odor.
Where there had been habitual withdrawal, an unremarkable steadiness began to form. This is not salvation. The observer had been careful to say resistance would be strong at first. You will mistake boredom for progress, it warned. Not every quiet will lead to change. Many remain quiet because they have learned to submit. Sign 1 contains a practice and a trap. Many will perform presence as another item to check off. Sitting 20 minutes can become a desperate tick box rather than a retraining. The difference is in the way one approaches the act, curiosity versus duty. Curiosity cultivates, duty calcifies. Richard learned to greet the discomfort without the expectation of revelation. Sometimes the 20 minutes felt worthless. Sometimes it rendered a small insight. He had been avoiding a call from his daughter, he realized, because he feared making promises he could not keep. Presence sharpened the recognition of such small evasions. The observer's narrative moved then to a second symptom, and when it did, the room seemed to fill with the texture of newspapers and news feeds, the sensation of too many incidents pressed into a single, sliding frame. You will not like this one, it said gently. Sign 2, normalization of chaos. It is a hard thing to name because it disguises itself as endurance. Imagine a siren that has been wailing for months until the threshold between noise and life is redrawn. Communities stop running toward the sound. An accident becomes another headline. The economy hiccups, and the explanation is routine. What was once scandalous becomes background. The observer described this phenomenon as a kind of habituation, alarm fatigue scaled up to the level of the polis. The modern vignettes arrived easily, a school district struggling with resources until underfunding becomes the normal, a public inquiry that finds corruption and then recedes from attention as a new outrage surfaces, citizens commenting at length but acting little. The consequence is not immediate ruin, but a rearrangement of expectations. Systems require alarm in order to be corrected. If alarm is damped by habituation, the system erodes, not through dramatic failure, but through toleration. Kethera's example was sharp and distant. On that planet, repeated environmental shocks were met with an engineered stoicism. The populace developed rituals to mark the shocks and then carry on as if nothing had shifted structurally. Over cycles, the rituals remained, while the capacity for effective repair dwindled. Tarvesh, in another account, cultivated ingenious repairs, but only for visible infrastructure, the roofs, the bridges, while social agreements, the unwritten codes of neighborliness, frayed beyond repair. Both civilizations learned to live with what should have been intolerable. Richard thought of the quiet normalization he had seen, municipal meetings where no one remembered why a bridge had been closed in the first place, workplaces where safety protocols were occasionally skipped because the deadline justified it. He considered the way media compresses outrage into forms that can be consumed and then discarded. Outrage is efficient as a tension currency, but it often fails as a mechanism for durable repair. The observer used the word atrophy again. Alarms atrophy when we treat emergency as entertainment. Infrastructural problems atrophy when our memory shortens and our empathy grows faint. The antidote the observer offered to this second sign was not a policy fix. It could not prescribe legislation. Its role was diagnostic. For individuals, it suggested a practice that was less inward than the 20-minute sitting and more outwardly vigilant, refusal to normalize. The instruction was deceptively simple. When you witness dysfunction within your family, your neighborhood, your workplace, declare it as such. Name it. Say aloud, "This is not normal." That articulation performs a small moral act. It resists the cultural tendency to absorb the unacceptable into routine. Richard tried this as well, and it proved more awkward than silent presence because it required the negotiation of social risk. The first time he said it aloud was in a grocery line, listening to two neighbors glorify a civic shortcut that compromised safety. "This is not normal," he said, hearing the words more than thinking them. The line fell silent. One of the neighbors laughed uneasily, then changed the subject. But another voice, softer, said, "Yeah, it shouldn't be." The observer had been right. Refusing to normalize was contagious in a modest, human way. It did not rewrite policy overnight. It nudged the field of what was speakable. Yet naming alone could be performative too. The observer cautioned against a theater of moral superiority where people parade their indignation without joining repair. Refusal to normalize must pair with small acts of care, phoning a council member, attending a meeting, volunteering to shovel a neighbor's steps. It is the coupling of moral clarity with scaled acts of maintenance that holds a system in place. You do not repair a bridge with moral outrage alone. You do it with labor, coordination, and the willingness to be present to other people's needs. As the observer marked these practices, Richard felt the room around him breathe in new shapes: presence, refusal, repair. He imagined the three as interlocking muscles. A society without attention is a house without inhabitant. A society that normalizes chaos removes the urgency to maintain. A society without purpose has nothing to repair toward. The pieces fit with an elegant cruelty. They were not accusations, they were a map. But even maps have consequences.
The observer's voice shifted for a moment into a cadence of pattern recognition that felt like walking through a gallery of case studies. "You have asked how change happens," it said. "You have asked if small acts can matter. There is a mechanism," it offered, "but it moves on slow clocks, ones longer than a single lifetime and not entirely beholden to mortality." Here the alien, whose transmission had been steady and clinical up to this point, gave a number as if furnishing a footnote. In the translations that Richard received, phrases such as critical minority took on the weight of theory translated into human words. The alien spoke of thresholds and timescales, roughly 8 to 12%, roughly 3 to 7 generations. These were not commandments, but empirical variables in their observational set. In the observer's recorded cases, when a committed minority of that magnitude sustained interior practices across multiple generations, societies rearranged themselves toward renewal rather than dissolution. When such a minority failed to emerge, the decay continued. Numbers have a seductive power, and Richard felt their pull. 8 to 12% sounded precise, small enough to be plausible, large enough to be significant.
The generational frame, 3 to 7, stretched beyond his lifetime and made the challenge less heroic and more patient. That, the observer made clear, was the point. Transformation is not the product of dramatic conversion, but of patient accretion. It is not a revolution, but a slow realignment of commitments, habits, and local cultures. You should understand, the observer added, that these figures are descriptive within our set of observations. They are not prophecy. They are not guarantees. They are patterns we have seen in different soils and myths, the same ratio that tips an ecosystem from one stable state to another. The alien's insistence on humility mattered to Richard. It kept the message from becoming an ideology and located it as a tool for judgment rather than a doctrine to swear by. He felt the pressure of that timescale immediately. It displaced the frantic longing to save everything today and replaced it with something heavier, a responsibility measured by endurance. If 8% of a population sustained the practices of presence, refusal to normalize, and purposeful inquiry, if they wove these habits into family rites, into schools, into local economies, then over several generations a different culture could emerge. Conversely, the absence of those practices meant systems could degrade until care became an anomaly. Richard ran the numbers in his head in his own way, as any historian might. What does 8% of a town look like? In a college town of 30,000, it would be 3,000 people. In a neighborhood of a few dozen houses, it would be a family and a couple of friends. The scale was, in a perverse way, approachable. It asked for steady work rather than grand gestures. It suggested that small groups, small circles, could be the architecture of long-term resilience. He imagined, then, a chain of modest households practicing morning silence together, a book club that read philosophy not for entertainment but to rehearse moral imagination, a group of neighbors who named what should not be normalized and then did the tedious work of maintenance. The observer called these small circles and treated them as the fibers that, braided together, become a rope strong enough to cross generational divides. The revelation of the numbers did not sink Richard into hope or despair. It left him at the edge of a decision. The 3 signs were laid out. The practices suggested were simple yet demanding. The scales of time were not dramatic, but relentless. He could retreat and say this was beyond him, too slow, too large, too intangible, or he could begin to stitch these practices into his personal life and watch for small social reciprocations. He chose the latter that night, not dramatically, but with the sort of stubbornness that had marked his scholarship. He continued his 20 minutes. He practiced naming the unacceptable. He began, in a small way, to ask himself the third question, which the observer would not fully elaborate yet, but had hinted at. Why does this matter? Who do I become if my life is only maintenance of comfort and the avoidance of pain? The query was less a solution than an excavation. Before dawn broke, the kitchen's rectangle of light thinned, and the world moved again toward its ordinary rhythms. The presence withdrew as quietly as it had arrived, like a tide folding back from the shore. The crickets resumed their chorus, this time slightly off-key, as if heard from a margin of distance. Richard sat still. He felt both more exposed and less alone. He did not tell anyone that morning. The moment was private, and private moments have a fragile economy. He wrote in his notebook instead, the labels, the practices, a few lines about the odd neutral cadence of the voice that had called itself the observer. He wrote down the 3 signs plainly: internal disconnection, normalization of chaos, loss of collective purpose. Each label felt like a wound and a window at once. The world continued its banal insistence, calls to return library books, an email about a seminar on the ethics of Reconstruction, the kettle's whistle. But now Richard's attention worked differently. He felt in the small motions of a day new testing grounds for habits he had only just chosen to cultivate. In the subway that afternoon, he watched a mother and her child. The child jabbed at a tablet, eyes bright, fingers fluent. The mother scrolled through a feed that promised novelty at each touch. They were physically close, yet absent from each other. Richard could have judged them and walked on. Instead, he found a practiced reserve and gave himself a moment to breathe inwardly, one breath of curiosity rather than condemnation. He noticed, with the muted relief of a quiet experiment, that curiosity opened a door where judginess slams it. At the end of the week, a neighbor knocked. Helen lived across the hall and had known Richard for a decade. She came by with a loaf of bread and something else in her face, a question. "You look different," she said, as if surprised to be speaking to the same stranger who had once been content to occupy the same physical space without engagement. Richard told her, carefully and without making any claim to cosmic authority, that he had been sitting each morning. She listened as if to a small local possibility rather than a global prescription. "Maybe I'll try it," she said. The words were small, and yet they felt like a hinge turning. This was the scale he could live with, small, repeated, human. The observer's transmissions had not promised miracles. They had given a framework, an invitation to habit. It was a kind of work that did not match the language of headlines. It was not sweepingly glamorous. It was ordinary. Still, the presence of the three signs in his life opened other, darker vistas. If internal disconnection and normalized chaos and the erosion of purpose were present here, what of societies larger and more complex? The observer's gallery of cases expanded in his imagination. Late Roman neighborhoods where citizens withdrew from public life, the Mayas' abandonment of once thriving plazas, Sumerian cities where the administrative networks frayed. Each historical image carried weight, but also humility. The past did not predetermine the future. It offered a script of possibility. When that evening came, Richard opened his notebooks to a fresh page and, with the careful serif of a scholar, began to jot a list. Practices to test, people to ask, small circles to form. He wrote the word presence at the top, and then a timetable. Mornings at 8, 20 minutes. Thursdays, coffee with Helen to discuss one item of civic concern. A plan to attend the Neighbors Association meeting and, if he felt the fit, to speak. The choice to attend a meeting is the kind of small, tangible act the observer indicated as essential. It is the difference between naming the unacceptable in solitude and taking a breath in public where others might hear your voice. The act of showing up, even once, alters the vector of a life. It opens the chance for someone else to say, "I've been feeling the same thing." It creates the possibility of a mutual contract, a seed of that 8 to 12% in miniature. Already in these first days there were unexpected reciprocations. A young man who ran the local bookstore heard about Richard's practice and proposed a short reading circle on attention. A retired nurse offered to coordinate a community watch, not out of paranoia, but as a mutual aid network. Small people, small acts. This was the method, it seemed. Few enough to be concentrated, committed enough to persist. Yet the sense of being observed by something that did not judge but cataloged did not leave Richard. He found himself thinking of the observer when he slept and when he woke. The alien had not revealed its motives, but had shown a patient pattern. It had offered 3 signs, sketched interventions, and then, importantly for Richard, left the rest to human agency. The alien had not come to save them, it had come to point. The rest, by design, belonged to the species that continued to tell its own stories. There is a peculiar humility in being given a diagnosis without a doctor. You are told what is wrong and told, in effect, to find the doctors among yourselves. It is an invitation that asks for imagination and stamina. It asks for an acknowledgement that the work of rebuilding is not glamorous and is generational. It asks, in the end, for certain habits to be present and for people to risk the small exposure of naming what once would have been swallowed in silence. In the nights that followed, Richard's practice became both personal and communal. He met the bookstore owner in a corner lined with worn spines. They read a page from a philosopher who wrote about attention as a moral act. The discussion was low and awkward at first. Then someone in the group said plainly, "We're tired." The admission was unceremonious and more illuminating than any theory. Tiredness is not only a personal symptom, it is often the social symptom of interior depletion. The small circle acknowledged it, and then, more importantly, began to think about what might be done together to buffer the daily erosion. Yet the second sign, normalization of chaos, continued to rattle in Richard's head. In the background of the week, a news cycle reported yet another scandal, a municipal contract awarded under dubious circumstances that, weeks later, drew only perfunctory commentary. The outrage was efficient, the repair was not. Richard felt the familiar historian's ache. How many small permissions to tolerate add up to the hollowing of a civic spine? One afternoon, he found himself at the community center, watching a meeting where volunteers debated the allocation of funds. Some people argued with generous impatience. Others had grown resigned, their faces folded with the habitual knowledge that systems rarely respond to good arguments. Richard remembered the observer's recommendation, refusal to normalize paired with maintenance. He stood, and with more steadiness than he expected in his voice, suggested a modest program, scheduled communal repair sessions to address small infrastructure issues like peeling paint, loose railings, window seals. The suggestion was practical and immediately implementable. Some at the meeting nodded, some were skeptical, but the proposal moved the field a bit. At the end of the meeting, a younger woman came up and said, "If you're serious about next Saturday, I'll bring my tools." It was, once again, a hinge toward something that might, over time, become habit. The observer's pattern had, in Richard's life, a clear beginning. He had seen the 3 signs labeled and felt them resonate in small moments. He had begun practices and seen small reciprocities. But the bigger arc, how those small circles aggregate into a critical mass and how long change takes, remained to be fully felt. The alien's numbers had suggested patience as the true currency of transformation. For now, he could only peep the small obligations, mourning presence, naming the unacceptable, meeting people where they were, and making repair visible. At night, when sleep finally came, Richard dreamed not of aliens, but of a staircase in a public forum. It was wide, marble, and unused, an empty staircase leading to a hall with rich tapestries. In the dream, he stood at the base, noticing the dust on each step. He could have climbed lightly, his shoes whispering across the stone, or he could have started sweeping. The dream offered no single directive. It offered a decision repeated countless times, to climb for spectacle or to tend the stairs so that others might climb without slipping. He woke before making the choice. The observer's retreat had left a kind of quiet that was less empty than charged. Its visit had not been a prophecy, but a kind of diagnosis that required the collaboration of ordinary people to act on it. Richard felt the gravity of this. He had no authority to command others, only the modest authority of a person who shows up and practices. He had, too, a responsibility to translate what he had been given into forms his neighbors could use, a short reading list, a framed sign that read, "This is not normal," for the community center, an offer to lead an early morning practice. There were resistances. Some friends called his new habits quaint. Others found him a little strange, newly insistent on the quality of attention. He learned to accept mild ridicule as part of the social cost of trying to change habits at the margin. The observer had been candid about this. Those who choose to resist the tide of normalization will sometimes be alone in the middle of the current. The question it had implicitly left hanging, and which now gnawed at him in the emptier hours, was whether enough people could feel the same private discomfort and make similar public moves. One afternoon, as the sun slid low and the city took on a warmer tone, Richard sat on the stoop and watched a small boy chase pigeons. The boy's attention was absolute, and existence wholly in the present. It was a fleeting thing. Children are living examples of what adult attention can recover, but often does not. Richard thought of the anthropology of attention, of what it takes to cultivate presence and what it costs to lose it. He thought about the kind of social grammar that allows a child to be present and a neighbor to notice. It seemed both fragile and, mercifully, recoverable. The observer's voice returned to him, not as a transmission now, but as an echo in the architecture of his decisions. There were, it had said, other cases, civilizations where every warning had been ignored, cities that had become museums and not homes. But there were also cases where small circles had braided together and the land had changed. It was not determinism, it was inclination. That evening, hovering between the small experimental victories and the shadow of larger patterns, Richard prepared for a public meeting at the community center he had committed to attend. He felt the strange combination of dread and curiosity that accompanies any attempt to make the private public. He rehearsed no speech. He had instead a short list of concrete proposals and one phrase to say if the discussion drifted into complacency: "This is not normal." He did not know how many people would respond. He did not yet understand how those responses might accrete into the 8 to 12% the observer had spoken of. What he knew was more modest. There were habits he could keep, invitations he could extend, and small risks he could take. The rest was a slow experiment carried by ordinary men and women, one day at a time. As he stepped out into the cool air, the sky a ribbon of early twilight, he felt the texture of urgency softened by practice. The alien's visit had been alarming in its clarity, but it left him with a practical set of choices rather than a deadline. The diagnosis had given him 3 lenses through which to look at a society that often seemed to be sleeping with its eyes half closed. It had also given him a method, not a miracle, of repair. He walked to the meeting, the click of his shoes syncing with the pace of his thinking. In the back of his head, a question kept returning, less a thought than a steady beat. Can we, in our small, stubborn ways, become the 8% that matters? The question was not meant to be answered that night. It was instead a horizon he might steer toward. The community center smelled of old coffee and paper. People trickled in, faces familiar and new. A fluorescent light hummed. Richard found a chair and, as the meeting began, felt the rhythm of small social repair commence. Introductions, a recounting of problems, a proposal, a debate. He listened more than he spoke. When the moment arrived, he offered his 3 simple commitments: presence, refusal to normalize, and a willingness to form a small circle for maintenance. And he watched how those words, unadorned, moved across the room. At one point, a man at the table scoffed softly and called the idea idealistic. Richard could have argued the history vignettes. He could have recited the observer's inventory. Instead, he said only, "I know it seems slow. I only ask for a try." The ask was small, and it landed with the modest dignity of a practical offer. It did not convert, but it did not fail either. When the meeting dispersed, a handful of people lingered outside in the cold, hands in pockets, talking in low voices about Saturday mornings and paint and tools. Helen hugged Richard and said, "We'll start with the bench at the park." The bench seemed trivial and strangely significant. It was, he realized, the kind of thing that could become a ritual, and rites have the power to change the shape of a neighborhood. That night, walking home through a city that glowed like a low-heat ember, Richard felt the observer's presence not as a cosmic guarantee, but as a companion in a difficult, patient undertaking. The alien had given him a vocabulary, 3 signs, a set of practices, a measure of generational patience, and in return it had asked nothing more than for humans to decide whether they would learn the exercises of attention. There was, in the margins of the evening's small triumphs, a tightness. The 3rd sign, the observer had told him, was the hardest to name because it is an absence, loss of collective purpose. Richard had not yet felt its full weight. He knew it in outline. When people stop imagining futures that include common projects, when they stop building things for the next generation because the categories that once made such building coherent have eroded, then a civilization doesn't fall in a day. It forgets, generation by generation, how to be more than a set of need-satisfying operations. He went to bed that night with that 3rd sign pressed like a cold coin under his pillow. The dream that came later would be of an empty theater, chairs unoccupied, velvet dust on the stage. Someone had once rehearsed a play there. Someone had once believed an audience would come. The theater stands as a metaphor, not because all human projects are theatrical, but because crafting a shared future requires an audience and actors. Without either, the building remains a building and not a living institution. When the sun rose, the day delivered its ordinary incidental trivia: the mail, a neighbor's cat on the windowsill, a bus late on the route. But the interior of Richard's day had shifted. He felt the pressure of the observer's 3 signs like a hand on his shoulder, reminding him to breathe, to name, and to join. Outside, in the city's patterns, the same forces moved indifferently. Corporations arranging services, municipal budgets balancing, people finding ways to be busy. The 3 signs did not announce themselves with drums. They were present in the small compromises and routinized tolerances. That was the insidiousness of them. They were ordinary. And yet, ordinary things make up the architecture of destiny. He had begun to practice. He had begun to speak. Small circles were forming like slow, patient roots. The alien's diagnosis had not translated into a manifesto. It had translated into a work plan for shaping attention and repair. For now, that had to suffice. As the day closed and the city moved toward that hour when crickets begin again to carve the night, Richard opened his notebook to write what he had seen and what he had chosen. He listed practices to teach, people to invite, rituals to start. He stopped at the 3rd item and wrote in a single line, "Begin the question." He meant the honest question the observer had nudged at, the one about why we keep going, about what sustains collective will. He would not push it on anyone tonight. Questions find their time. He would, however, lay the ground for them. Outside his window, a light blinked in a distant apartment, and then another answered. Small, human lights. The observer's voice had returned to the periphery of his thought one last time that evening. "We will continue to observe," it said lightly, translating the alien's promise into a human cadence he could accept. "We will watch what you do with what you have heard." Richard closed his notebook. He was, in some way, more frightened than before, and in another way less so. The 3 signs had been given names, the habit work had begun, the scale and slowness of what might be required had been made clear. He had taken the first steps. He had not yet felt the full weight of the 3rd sign. He had not yet seen whether the small circles could thread together into that elusive 8%. That uncertainty, like many others, would have to be borne with patience and steady practice. He turned out the light and waited for sleep. The crickets were back, steady and insistent. In the silence that followed, he rehearsed for himself 3 acts: 20 minutes of presence, a refusal allowed when complacency met his neighbor's gossip, and an initiation of the question of purpose in a small group. If all 3 were practiced day by day, he thought, perhaps the scaffolding of a different future might begin to appear.
That signal traveled in small increments. A dog walker trained his path to include the bench. An elderly woman sat and fed crumbs to pigeons in a way that connected her to the neighborhood. A teenager who had been expelled from a program picked up a brush and stayed. The bookstore reading circle grew, too, in fits and starts. At first, they read a slim book on attention. Then a local educator suggested adapting the practice for a summer program at the elementary school. The school principal listened politely, but said, "We have testing and standards." Richard understood the barrier. Institutions often run on measurable outputs, not slow formation. Still, one teacher agreed to pilot a 5-minute morning gathering where children would be invited to sit quietly before the day's lessons. The pilot was small, 1 classroom for 2 weeks, but the teachers reported a modest thing. Children, when given space to be still together, argued less in the first half hour and settled quicker. It was only a classroom, but classrooms are the neighborhoods of attention for young people. They are where habits get their first scaffolding. Not everyone applauded. Some neighbors called the watching and naming practice moralizing. A local blogger wrote a short, snide piece about nostalgia for rituals and the quaint town who painted benches while the larger city traffic hummed on. A council member dismissed Richard at a public meeting as clinging to comforting gestures. Such pushes were inevitable. The Observer had been plain about social cost. Those who refuse normalization often become awkward in the present. They unsettle the ease of excuses. Yet when the bench's paint dried and a child slid down its back and laughed, the critic's commentary seemed small by comparison. The next test arrived not as headline thunder, but as a tributary of trouble. A sinkhole opened in a narrow residential street a few blocks away. It came after weeks of rain and a neglected culvert, the kind of infrastructure complaint that has been filed and deferred too many times. The hole made a neighbor's car unusable and ate a strip of sidewalk. People on social media shrugged, shared photos, and then commented with a distant bemusement that somebody should call the city. The conversation followed the familiar arc the Observer had named: alarm, distraction, forgetfulness. But because there were people who had begun to say the 3 words aloud, "This is not normal," the sinkhole became instead a focal event. The small circle that had formed around the bench organized a repair assessment. They were not engineers. They had, however, local persistence. They called a council aide, attended a meeting, and did the tedious work of documenting the site: photographs, names, a petition. One member of the storefront circle, a retired civil service worker, used her knowledge to articulate the likely municipal steps needed to fix the culvert. The bureaucratic wheels moved slowly, as bureaucracies do, but the persistent presence of neighbors who had formed a habit of showing up meant the issue did not fade as a memory. The city crews eventually repaired the culvert. The cost was municipal, but the neighborhood's sustained curiosity had turned what might have been a forgotten hazard into a repaired piece of infrastructure. The bench had not changed budgets, but it had helped keep a problem from being normalized. As these things often do, small successes bred small requests.
A youth group asked the bookstore whether they could host a night on practical skills, how to fix a leaky faucet, how to care for a bicycle. The repair sessions evolved into a calendar. Surprise followed. People who taught practical crafts found themselves sharing more than technique. One evening, a middle-aged man who had been quiet in meetings revealed, offhand, that he had lost his job months earlier, but had been too proud to say so. When the group offered to help with a toolkit and referrals, he accepted. Helping turned into mutual aid. Mutual aid turned into trust. Across the city, a few other small circles began to appear, not as replicas of Richard's group, but as echoes shaped by local context. A church that had always hosted a soup kitchen experimented with brief moments of deliberate attention before serving food. Just 3 minutes of breathing for volunteers, a check-in question asked before work began. A neighborhood association in another district convened a Repair 2 Hours event, where volunteers painted a fence and reinstalled a mailbox. None of these were sweeping policies, none promised to rebalance the city's larger inequities, but they were, in the observer's terms, the beginning of practice consolidations. The particularity of the acts mattered more than their size. The observer's numbers, 8 to 12%, 3 to 7 generations, hovered over Richard's mind like a long-term project plan. He began to imagine what durability looked like, not as an architectural feat, but as a pattern of transmission. If one household taught presence to a child, who then taught it to another child, the practice multiplied. If neighborhoods layered rituals, bench painting, morning silence in a classroom, a weekly repair shift, those layers could cohere into a modest culture. Patience remained the currency, work carried on in the species' time. This patience was tested by temptation, the seduction of immediate metrics. Local grant agencies loved measurable outputs, so Richard learned to translate slow formation into actionable proposals. A 6-month pilot for morning attention in 3 classrooms, with pre- and post-observations of behavioral markers, not clinical pronouncements, but classroom indicators like transition time and frequency of disruptions. He learned to write grant language that promised nothing miraculous and asked for the resources to experiment. It worked enough to fund a small teacher stipend and a shared set of materials. The paradox was constant. To seed patient habits, they needed the scaffolding of contemporary funding timelines. To carry the practices across generations, they needed cultural embedment. One supported the other in a fragile balance. When small circles form, they do not do so in a vacuum. They meet inertia, indifference, mockery, the slow drag of habit. Sometimes they meet active opposition. In one neighborhood, a developer proposed a redevelopment plan that would remove a row of small gardens where several residents grew food. The plan was presented as economic progress. The neighborhood split. People who had been trained in the habit of naming the unacceptable found themselves in an ethical negotiation. They formed a petition, attended planning hearings, and offered alternative proposals that balanced upkeep costs with community benefit. The vote did not entirely go their way, but their presence at meetings altered the terms of discussion. The developer agreed to create a smaller public garden rather than demolish every green plot. The partial victory felt bittersweet. It was improvement via compromise, not decisive triumph. It was, in the observer's language, the kind of incremental reweaving that moves a social fabric without ever promising perfection. Not all stories turned toward repair. Across the sea of cases the observer had described, some civilizations failed to develop rituals of attention, or they developed them but throttled them through hypocrisy. Tarvesh, one of the observer's comparative cases, had initially cultivated impressive technological systems while neglecting the social grammar that binds people into common projects. Its preserved buildings became scenic backdrops for private accumulation. Kethera, in contrast, had a period where it reasserted communal rituals and rebalanced public and private life enough to avert ossification in some regions. The point was not to champion one culture over another, but to show variance. Patterns recur, but outcomes depend on choices, contexts, and persistence. Richard had moments of despair. News cycles brought scandals and tragedies that tested his small network's resolve. A local factory closed, laying off dozens. A series of petty thefts rattled a corner shop. These events invited the old easy response, helplessness. The observer's voice did not reappear like a deus ex machina. It offered once, as Richard sat on the bench with paint under his fingernails, a short observation. We have seen societies repeat these arcs when attention goes elsewhere. The transmission was a reminder, not a comfort. It nudged him back toward the practical. Call the aid organization, support the laid-off workers, host skills nights that might help people re-enter the workforce. Doing was not curing the structural causes, but it made a space for neighbors to act instead of to merely watch. Time accumulated.
Months folded into a year. The children who had watched adults paint benches grew more familiar with the sight of neighbors present. The morning classroom practice expanded to 2 more rooms. A teacher reported that a child who had been chronically late began arriving on time more often after his mother joined the neighborly repair mornings. The mother explained shyly that the small rituals had given her something like a schedule to anchor her day. The web was small and local, but it was real. Richard kept his notebook and added entries like a ledger of persistence: who came when, who dropped off, the color of rain that day, a line of commentary about what had been learned. At one point, a journalist from a regional paper called to ask about the bench story. He wanted a human interest angle, only 2 paragraphs, the editor said, about quaint townsfolk painting and bonding. Richard declined a single-sentence quote and instead offered to let the reporter sit in on a reading circle. Curious as they were, journalists sometimes paint with a quick brush. But the reporter stayed 2 hours, asked awkward questions, and then wrote a piece that captured the human labor without romanticizing it. The article traveled farther than Richard expected. People in other neighborhoods wrote to ask if they could start similar groups. A slow replication began to ripple outward, a dozen communities forming their own modest rituals. Some lasted, some dissolved. Diffusion in the human world is rarely neat. The observer's critical mass figure returned to the foreground as a speculative horizon, 8 to 12%. Richard thought like a historian and like a citizen. He imagined neighborhoods in which a committed minority could sustain practices across familial lines. He imagined schools where morning silence was part of an ethos, community centers that scheduled maintenance rituals, and small economies that rewarded care. This was not utopia, it was durable practice. It would not solve macroeconomic injustice or climate volatility single-handedly. But in the array of cases the observer had collected, cultures with these fibers tended to reorient toward resilience. At home, the simple act of presence by the sink had knotted into other relationships. Richard called his daughter more honestly. He began to keep commitments in small but visible ways. She noticed. They argued less. She mentioned in passing that she had found a therapist and was navigating the quiet with him. She did not attribute her move to any particular practice of her father's, and Richard made no claim either. He had learned humility. People change on their own timelines with their own combinations of reasons. His presence may have mattered. It also may have been a background element to her own journey. That was okay. Generational change is an awkward thing for a man in his 70s to measure. Richard could not expect to see 3 to 7 generations in his lifetime.
The observer's time span made the work credible and heavy. It removed some of the frantic desire to fix everything, but it also asked for patience beyond a single lifetime. It required that the practices be made legible to future caretakers. So Richard focused on making the habits teachable and repeatable. He offered simple instructions for morning practice, wrote a one-page handout about refusal to normalize, and created a small prompt list for discussion about purpose. He did not want ritualism for its own sake. He wanted habits that could be transmitted like recipes, clear, repeatable, adaptable. The third sign, the loss of collective purpose, remained the hardest to confront directly, because absence is not as visible as presence or even as a sinkhole. It was often encoded in choices: fewer community festivals, dwindling youth sports teams, buildings closed because no one wanted to steward them. A town with empty maternity wards was not necessarily dying. It might be experiencing demographic shifts for many reasons, but where a culture had unmoored its imagination for future-making, where the default was consumption and maintenance without generative projects, a drift toward ossification was possible. The remedy here was less a simple practice and more of an invitation. Ask honest questions about what binds us forward. Richard started a modest experiment with a question-based evening. Once a month, a small circle gathered to ask and journal about why do we do this together. Participants wrote for 10 minutes, shared a sentence or two, and then discussed whether the evening's answers suggested any small collective projects. The query was not a quick fix. Sometimes it produced only the relief of being heard. Other times it produced an idea, an intergenerational mentorship program at the library, a local garden expanded into a seed bank, a community timeline of local history that kids could help research. These projects were small scaffolds for shared purpose. They did not require consensus on grand ideology, only overlapping commitments. Not every attempt bore fruit. A proposal to convert an old theater into a community art space stalled when funding evaporated. The circle learned the labor of grant writing, and the project limped along for months until an unexpected donor closed the gap. Some members left the group, kindled by personal issues. Others stayed. The work of purposeful inquiry required stubbornness and a tolerance for partial outcomes. Richard's notes cataloged each attempt with a historian's curiosity: success, delay, failure, lesson. In the middle of that second year, a sudden local crisis tested their practices in an unexpected way. A regional heat wave hit hard, and the city's aging power grid faltered. Rolling outages became the norm for several days. In the absence of constant electricity, routine distractions vanished. Screens dimmed, refrigerators warmed. The world seemed to slide back into an older, slower pace. Where people might once have curled inward, some neighbors connected. Block-level check-ins formed. Vulnerable individuals were visited. Cool spaces in community centers opened as refuges. The small circles convened with practical energy. They set up a schedule to check on elders, moved perishable food to coolers, and coordinated with volunteers at the library to host daytime respite. This maintenance was not purely heroic. It also revealed unequal burdens. Those without access to reliable transport or community ties suffered more. The small circles could not universalize care overnight, but their presence reduced harm at a localized level. The crisis highlighted the limits of small practices. They can mitigate and sometimes change contingency trajectories, but they cannot single-handedly re-engineer structural risk. Still, these moments of testing also showcased how a committed minority can alter outcomes in meaningful ways. The observer had noticed this pattern in many of its cases. When practices are in place, societies respond differently to stress. The heat wave receded. The city repaired an aging transformer. Public forums convened and spoke about infrastructure investment. Here again, the balance between individual action and systemic change became clear. The small circles could apply pressure and creativity. Governance and public funding were necessary for broader resilience. But in a world of limited political will, the small circle's capacity to hold attention and to name what was not normal nudged public agendas in incremental but real ways. Time continued. A few years passed. The bench remained painted, though its color faded in some spots and was refreshed in others. Children of the original painting group, now older, taught new kids how to sand rough wood. The morning practices had diffused into neighboring schools, with uneven adoption, but with pockets of durable habit. Helen, who had once been a casual acquaintance, became a core member and often led the bench mornings. The bookstore reading circle moved to a larger space and added a table for a community skills exchange. The numbers, 8 to 12%, remained a speculative horizon. In Richard's small town, it was unclear whether they were near that threshold. Yet he noticed phenomena the observer's framework helped name. In places where the three practices had been woven into everyday life, coordination felt easier. People held one another to commitments, not through public shaming, but through habitual presence. They found time, or made it. There were also losses. A member of the small circle died suddenly, and the group mourned. A young person who had been enthusiastic moved away for work. The ebb and flow of life continued. The project was not a tidy success story, but a layered human reality of gain and loss. That ambivalence was part of the patience the observer had described.
The work of formation tolerated attrition. The ethos was to keep going rather than to demand perfect retention. During one quiet evening, as Richard sat with his notebook under a streetlight, he felt the alien observation in a new register, not as an external judgment, but as an archival record of human attempts. He imagined the observer's ledger of 47 civilizations as a neutral anthology, each entry a testimony of attempts, failures, and rare realignments. He found comfort in the idea that history contains examples of people who practiced presence and repair, and that those examples had, in some cases, forced different cultural trajectories. The presence of precedent did not make success assured, it made it plausible. Outreach became a new axis. People in neighboring towns began to email about their own bench projects, their reading circles, and their struggles to maintain momentum. Richard and a few others created a modest set of resources, a short guide to 20-minute presence, plain instructions, not therapeutic claims, a one-page note on naming the unacceptable with suggested phrasing, and a set of prompts for group inquiry into purpose. They offered these as humble tools, no promises attached, available to anyone who wanted to try. The resources were shared freely, sometimes printed in community halls, sometimes posted in a local newsletter. Adoption was irregular. The point was not to scale in advertising terms, but to seed. At this stage, the narrative began to feel generational in a way that surprised Richard. A neighbor's grandson learned to sand a bench and asked to sit during the morning circle. The boy's parents were not regulars, but they appreciated that their son had a place to practice steadiness. Small rituals sometimes leapt across family lines. The idea of generations, 3 to 7, stayed an abstract shape, but the movement of practices from older to younger signaled the beginning of transmission. He did not romanticize it. Children change. Modern life complicates transmission. But transmission could occur, partly through deliberate rituals and partly through daily habit. The observer, in a brief mental insertion one late night when Richard worried about broader trends, offered a measured image. Think of culture as an ecosystem. What you plant today shapes the soil for those who follow. The alien's tone remained clinical, but there was an implicit tenderness in the metaphor. It did not dictate, it simply offered a frame. As the years moved, Richard observed a curious synergy. Small acts of repair made public space more habitable, and public habitation, in turn, made small acts feel less risky. When a bench is used, it legitimizes being present. When a classroom routines silence together, it legitimizes attention in public environments. These habits, repeated and visible, made it somewhat easier for others to step into new roles. Cultural grammar shifted slowly.
If there was any danger, it was complacency disguised as progress. The group sometimes mistook ritual for transformation, checking the box of morning silence while failing to connect those moments to deeper questions of purpose. The observer had warned of this trap. Practices without inquiry calcify into performative acts. To guard against performance, Richard insisted in meetings that their rituals always be paired with reflection. What did you notice in those 20 minutes? Who did we try to include today? What does our maintenance work teach us about what we value? The question of purpose remained an open field. Once, during an evening of inquiry, a young woman in the group, newly arrived and quiet, said, "I keep thinking, if we save this theater, who will come? How do we ensure there's a future audience?" Her question was raw and painful. The group could have offered platitudes. Instead, they brainstormed. Start a film series where kids curated short films. Invite nearby schools to perform. Host community storytelling nights. The theater idea grew from a wistful hope to a small program scheduled for weekends. The program did not guarantee a rejuvenated arts scene, but it gave the space a purpose temporarily reactivated by human initiative. This was the experimental logic the observer had implied. Purpose is not discovered in isolation, it is seeded in shared acts and tested publicly. A city that has rituals, maintenance, and spaces for creative trial will more readily generate projects that persist. That is not to say that economic or political structures do not matter. They matter greatly. The story here is limited. It is about what ordinary people can do to alter local fields of possibility. Years folded into a pattern. Richard aged, continued his habits, and watched others take up the work. He became less the single initiator and more a custodian of practice. He taught a neighbor to lead morning silence sessions, and she in turn recruited others. The knowledge of how to refuse normalization, how to name the unacceptable without moralizing, spread in small pockets. It did not become a civic religion, it became a series of techniques people could adopt when and where they found them useful. One spring, at a book event in the bookstore, a young man stood and read a paragraph from a piece he had written about attention and belonging. He said simply, "I learned to show up because someone showed up for me when my apartment flooded." The anecdote was modest. Its effect was large. It illustrated the whole point. Small acts of care become precedents for future acts of care. They are not dramatic. They are accumulative. Richard lived long enough to see some of these accumulations stick. That knowledge made him careful with rhetoric. He refused to frame the story as a triumph. Instead, he cultivated a posture of ongoing work. "Do not expect overnight salvation," he would say, when someone sought a neat arc.
Expect work and accidents, partial victories and tragic losses. Practice anyway. The observer continued to be, in his mind, an external index. He thought of their 47 observations and the 17 that had realigned. He thought of those as case studies, useful, not authoritative. When he spoke at a small regional gathering about his experience, he included the numbers precisely as the observer had transmitted them, part of the transmission, not the final word. People appreciated the humility. They had, after all, learned to mistrust grandiosity and to prefer testable habits. In the end, the test of any intervention is human continuity. One evening, during a neighborhood harvest festival that none of them had envisioned a decade earlier, Richard walked through a crowd of people eating, laughing, and moving slowly between tables. Children darted between adults, faces bright and uncontained. A faded bench held a line of people who had painted it years ago. A mural near the park, created by a community art night, depicted a staircase, a private image from Richard's dreams, now full of painted footprints. People didn't know the exact lineage of the practices that had shaped their evening. They only felt the benefits of being present and tended. He stood by the bench and watched sunlight move across the planks. A young person he had once met in a reading circle sat down beside him. They did not speak grandly. They shared, however, a quiet recognition. To be there was to be part of a continuum. The young person looked at him and said plainly, "I want to keep this going." Richard thought of the 3 to 7 generations line and the slow work that remained. He felt less the urgency of a man racing against time and more the steady steadiness of someone handing off a tool. Before that night ended, Richard opened his notebook and wrote a short note for himself, more than anyone else. Persistence is not heroism, it is practice. He underlined it twice. Then he added a small list: people to teach the morning practice, possible partners for the theater, an evening to host a larger circle on purpose. The list was a working archive. He closed the book and walked home under a sky where early stars were beginning to prick. He felt the soft press of uncertainty and the steadier shape of commitment. The final transmission the observer gave him, months later, and quite ordinary, was not a sermon, but a provision. Remember that you are not alone in being human. That was all. It reframed the entire visit. The aliens had not given a mandate, they had offered a lens. With that lens, Richard and his neighbors had made choices, some small, some awkward, some brave. Those choices changed the texture of their days. They might not remake the global arc of history. They might, however, nudge the local arc of life in ways that made the city more inhabitable for a while longer. On the morning he turned 80, Richard walked to the bench with a thermos and a small loaf of bread. He sat and watched the city breathe. A group of children crossed the square, and for a moment the world seemed to be simply what it always had been. People making morning noises, pigeons flapping, car tires whispering on wet pavement. He felt the continuity of practices in his bones, the 10 minutes of silence, the refusal to normalize small wrongs, the monthly question circle probing purpose. They were not magic, they were scaffolds. He addressed the people who had gathered for the bench's annual repainting that morning, not with a manifesto, but with a question. "Will you keep showing up?" he asked. He did not expect a formal answer. People nodded, laughed, and reached for brushes. They did not promise generational transformation. They promised presence. For Richard, presence had become the point. The last scene in which he held the notebook closed was neither apocalyptic nor triumphant. It was domestic. The sun climbed, children climbed on the newly painted bench. Helen carried coffee in a thermos. A neighbor who had once been skeptical offered sandwiches. The city went on. The observer, if it watched, would have registered this small condition in its ledger, a place where people kept practicing, imperfectly and faithfully. If you are listening now, reader, viewer, neighbor, the alien said by way of transmission once more, not as a command, but as a recorded tendency, attention is the soil of culture, repair is the action of its tenders, purpose is the scaffold of futures. These are not predictions, they are observations, they are invitations. What will you do with that invitation? Will you cultivate 20 minutes of presence? Will you name when a thing is not normal? Will you ask why you are here beyond mere survival and begin to practice answers together? The future will not be given wholesale. It will be braided through small acts, stubborn companions, and patient people who show up. If this story has moved you and you'd like a modest set of tools to try these practices, a short guide to the 20-minute presence, a one-page handout on refusal to normalize, and prompts for purpose inquiry, there is a resource in the description. An ebook and an option for structured sessions with facilitators who offer guidance, not medical treatment. They are offered as practical supports for people ready to begin. They are not cures, and they are entirely optional. The bench smelled of fresh paint. The city uncoiled into its day. Richard folded his hands, breathed, and watched a child hand a paintbrush to an older person who had come only for the coffee. The brush changed hands as if to pass a habit. Outside, the world moved, as it always does. Inside, people had begun to practice being awake. Will you show up?